With me now, John Hajar with the American Mideast Coalition for Trump, who is calling on millions of voters to support what the organization calls the Freedom Candidate. First of all, let's talk about that name. Why are we calling Donald Trump? Why is your organization calling him the Freedom Candidate?
Well, we feel that Donald Trump has some unique ideas for foreign policy, which are sorely needed. People in the Middle East, people focus on Trump's wanting to erect a wall between the U.S. and Mexico and keep Muslim immigrants out. And he's refining his message as time goes on. He's not anti-immigrant. He's not anti-Muslim. He's anti-Islamist. We don't want Muslims that want to come to this country and import their ways without adopting to American customs and social mores, etc. And you can see the disastrous effects it's having in Europe. We want them to come here to assimilate, meaning we don't want Islamists, we want Muslims who want to come to this country, adopt our ways, who enjoy freedom, who are fleeing from the Middle East where they have had a dearth of freedom and have suffered for generations and centuries. So those are the Muslims that have come to this country in the past that have become part of the fabric of America. My grandparents immigrated from the Middle East,
right?
And they were fleeing the same thing that you see a lot of the migrants fleeing now. They were fleeing totalitarian ideologies, racism, religious bigotry, most notably against Christians and other minorities in the Middle East.
Well, but let me back up because there's a key distinction here. And you said that what you're looking for is what you believe should happen is that if someone who is Muslim is coming into this country, that they are coming here to assimilate, to become a part of the American culture, not to bring in their religion. But has Donald Trump ever made that point? Because I'm looking through quotes, and we'll go over them in a second. But my point is, how do you know if, say, a refugee comes over and if they're not willing to take on American ideals, which is a country of immigrants, or if they're just going to try to perpetuate what they believe is how to live their life?
Well, I think what I neglected to mention, in which is really the condition precedent, is first of all, let's settle the refugees in their homeland. They don't want to leave. The last thing people want to do is flee their homeland, and it's the disastrous consequences of the last 7 years of the Obama administration that have led to this complete breakdown in the Middle East. We had largely pacified Iraq at the end of the Bush presidency. You can argue, whether the invading in the first place was right or wrong, or how we made many mistakes. But one thing, it's unquestionable that Bush had pacified Iraq at the end of his term. There were the number of terrorist attacks, bombings, et cetera, was way down.
You think by sending in troops to Iraq, he pacified Iraq?
No, I'm talking at the end of his term.
Okay.
Unquestionably, it was much more peaceful in Iraq than it is now in 2008 when Obama, became president.
Okay.
Unquestionably, Syria was much better in 2008 than it is now. Here with 8 years later, or since 2011, 400,000. Obama drew the line in the sand, and that's exactly what it was when he mentioned that chemical weapons would cause him to take action.
Okay, so I get your opinion on foreign policy, but Trump is a candidate that has been quoted as saying, for example, in a 2011 interview, that even though the Quran is very interesting and people say it teaches love, there's something that teaches more of a negative vibe. He's never seen more hatred out there than in the Quran. So he's saying, he's been quoted so many times as saying that the Quran and Islam has more hatred than love across the board. Still, you're saying that this candidate, because of his foreign policy stance and because of his views on how immigrants should assimilate, should be our president.
Listen, Donald Trump is not a Quranic scholar, nor am I. But the facts speak for themselves.
But isn't he preaching hate more than acceptance?
Terrorism has grown 800% in the last 5 years. And who's carrying out this terrorism? Is it Anglicans? Is it Hindus? Is it Buddhists? Or is it sub-Saharan African animists? I mean, who's doing it? I mean, people aren't stupid. And, I know sometimes the language may be coarse, but, it's exactly that political
but we're talking beyond course. We're talking about someone who says ban all the Muslims, whether they are of an Islamic radical state or not, whether they are the type of Muslim that we might have as a neighbor next door or a terrorist. How do you make the distinction?
Well, I mean, this is the original point I want to make. In a Trump presidency, there will be cantons created in Syria, so that people don't have to leave and live in misery in camps in Europe or in Lebanon or Jordan. They can stay in their own country. And there's a region in eastern Syria the size of Connecticut.
Right. I get that viewpoint, but let's expand that. And he's
like we did after the first Gulf War in Iraq, which handcuffed Saddam Hussein at the time.
I get your viewpoint on the Syrian or the refugee crisis overall, but what I'm trying to understand is every quote that Donald Trump has put out there as far as letting Muslims in, it has no distinction between the businessman who needs to come to the United States to further his career or someone that is a refugee that is in that situation. Trump is speaking far-reaching.
On the first part of his statement. The second part of his statement was very clear. Until we know what's going on, he said it's a temporary.
How long is that going to take?
Well, I think he'll develop his policy, but I mean, I think unquestionably, when you have a catastrophe going on, the first thing you do is you go to triage. You stop the bleeding first. If you're a patient and you're bleeding profusely, before they determine the cause, you stop the bleeding. Right now, we can see it. It would be so callous in light of what's happening in Western Europe not to put a freeze on what's happening right now. And we know it's very well documented. ISIS has made it clear that there are ISIS partisans among the refugee flows into Europe. You can see an overwhelming number of men and young men at that among the refugees. So we know, yes, there are some legitimate refugees among them who are searching for a better life, and those people eventually will develop the vetting system and will let a fair number come. But I think let's take a more macro look here. Donald Trump has been speaking out against Muslims for decades. Excuse me?
Go ahead.
So, why? I mean, another point that President Obama has failed to make, that Donald Trump is making on a daily basis, is, you have Sunni Arab countries that are very wealthy in the region. Not Jordan. Jordan's a Sunni Muslim country majority, but it's a poor country. Saudi Arabia is a very wealthy country. Qatar, United Arab Emirates. They are very wealthy countries, and they have taken none. Why don't we use our influence to put pressure on them? I think just last week, Donald Trump said, if Saudi Arabia doesn't commit troops to fight ISIS, we'll stop buying their oil. That's the kind of creative leverage that we want, that resonates with people. They see all the money that this country contributes to the United Nations. And is there any gratitude in return for all that we've spent at the United Nations? Is there any gratitude from a lot of the Europeans, in fact?
Completely understand your frustration
of their GDP on defense.
Completely understand your frustration about foreign policy. Completely understand that as far as the refugee crisis is concerned. But what my question to you is, what about others? I mean, yes, that is a major issue that needs to be addressed. I see that your stance is more towards Donald Trump, trying to manage and understand the situation more before making any sort of sudden action. But my question to you is, Donald Trump for decades has been speaking negatively about Islam and Muslims in general. Who's to say that Donald Trump is not going to apply this?
Provide me some evidence of that. I'm unaware of.
Back in 2001, 2011, again, he said that he's never seen more tremendous hatred out there when speaking about what is in the Quran. That is the foundation of Islam. He's calling it a hateful religion and not a loving one. Why would we want to include people that that their faith is of hate?
Scholar, nor am I.
According to Donald Trump.
I think you'd have to have your head buried in the sand for at least since 9/11 not to see the rise in Islamic fundamentalism. Now it's 15 years. You don't. Unfortunately, there are moderate Muslims, the ones that are actively searching for a reformation of their religion. Their religion has never been reformed. There's no Martin Luther in Islam. And those ones are calling for reform. Unfortunately, their voices are in the small minority. I mean, you can point to numerous polls, Pew Research Center, and others that point to a high amount of radicalization among Muslims worldwide. And that's 1.5 billion people from many estimates. Now,
that the radical Muslims are 1.5 billion
not going to be suicide bombers, but there's a large number that sympathize and a small percent that would actively engage in terrorist acts.
So now the entire population, the entire Muslim population,
huge number of 1.5 billion.
Have to pay for that by not being allowed the at least opportunity to enter this country.
Well, I think, again, you're focusing on the first part of his statement and not the second. Our countries are, we're a country that has a constitution, that has the rule of law. We should be a country of laws. There should be vetting processes. And I think nowhere does it say in the Constitution that we should commit suicide and let untold number of people come into the country who are unsure of their motivation, unsure of their desire to assimilate. We want more legal immigrants. I mean, I'd up the number, and I think Donald Trump would as well. We want more people coming to this country. He has thousands of Latinos that work for him. My wife, for instance, is a Venezuelan immigrant. We want more of that. I think Donald Trump has said that on numerous occasions. But let's do it according to the rule of law.
Okay, but yet Donald Trump, we won't even get in on that subject, but Donald Trump has called many Latinos, the most famous quote is Mexicans are rapists. I mean, he has certainly created a narrative where many different cultures, he labels them, he writes them off as a group as a whole. And again, this brings me back to my point. How do you, when America is founded on people coming here for a new chance, how do you take one people group and say, yes, the Constitution applies, our ideals apply, but not to your group, especially when it's such a big group like people who follow Islam?
Well, I mean, it's unfortunate that the terrorist acts are not being committed by Mexicans, not being committed by...
But they're all rapists,
according to Donald Trump. Not being committed by Hindus or Buddhists or Christians or Catholics or Protestants. They're being committed by Muslims.
One thing I want to make clear is my understanding of his quotes, and he's been very direct about this, is to not let he wants to consider not letting any Muslim into this country until there's a methodology developed to determine if they're terrorists or not. Do you agree with that?
No, I think I've made this point over, but I'll say it again. I think a methodology has to be developed, and when it is, then we can address it. But I think that's not the pressing issue. You're putting the cart before the horse. Problem right now is terrorism. How many acts of terror do you need to see before you take some action? San Bernardino, in Paris, in Belgium, over and over and over again. Garland, Texas, there was almost a catastrophe there last year. We're seeing it over and over and over again. I think it's only common sense to ask for a moratorium until we know what's going on.
So stop all the Muslims from coming in until we determine what to do with them at an undetermined date.
First and foremost, create safe zones in Syria. Enforce with no-fly zones so people can live in their homeland and they can continue to thrive. Well, they're not thriving now, obviously, but they don't want to leave their homeland. We want them to stay where they are. They want to stay where they are. We've talked to many people from their different organizations. They want to stay. They'd love to have the U.S. and other powers, and we've failed miserably under the Obama administration putting together coalitions.
Okay, but I want to bring back to you
work with our Sunni Arab allies. Let's create the safe zones there so that people can stay in their homeland.
Okay, but I want to go back to one statement you made, which is true, that Donald Trump...
It's good to have millions of people, and incidentally, thousands losing their lives on the way, trying to get out of the hellhole that they're living in. That was just because of the abdication of responsibility of this administration. Never mind how do you vet them and should they come or not. Focus on the humanity, for God's sakes. These poor people don't want to leave their homeland. They don't want to travel thousands of miles with just the clothes on their back, taking all kind of risks, drowning in the Aegean. They want to stay home. Let's keep them home. Let's provide them with shelter, and let's provide them with whatever support they need to secure these zones in Syria.
But I think the biggest concern that people have, because I get your point, I get your opinion on the refugee crisis, I certainly do, and I think it's a fair opinion, but what I am trying to understand, and I'll use your words, is you agree that Donald Trump often paints with a very broad brush, especially when it comes to talking about Muslims. If Donald Trump becomes president, those statements, that broad brush now becomes policy initiatives. Now we're seeing moratoriums on people groups that represent percentages of the world. I mean,
listen, I'm going to have to run in a minute, but sure. Donald Trump is not a politician. I think that's a large part of his appeal. The fact that he speaks plainly. And yes, his language, and I've said it before, needs to be refined. However, he's good at identifying the problem. He understands, the issues. He's shown that he is a businessman, that he can deal with complex issues, surround himself with the right people, and come up with solutions. And that's what people want to see, because all they've seen in the from the political class in D.C. is the same old, either from the for the last 7 years, failed policies. The ideology is growing, is viral, is virulent, and it's spreading like wildfire. And we have a president that won't even address it. So stop worrying about the overstatements of Donald Trump, and let's worry about dealing with the issue. He's, as far as I know, the only candidate that's calling for these safe zones in the Middle East. That's what we need. That's humanity. And you may say that it sounds inhumane or callous or maybe it's touching sensitivities, but believe me, my
looks like we lost you here a little bit. Seeing if we can regain a connection here. All right, it looks like we lost our connection, but I think the point here is, all right, it looks like we lost the connection here, but we want to thank John for joining us. Of course, we've got to consider all sides here. John, of course, in support of Donald Trump becoming president.